Support this motion on the two-third gender rule and this report that was tabled. Mr. Speaker, I am a beneficiary of the affirmative action, Mr. Speaker. I am a beneficiary in the sense that I have been nominated in the Senate based on an affirmative action that was passed to ensure that we have equal representation of both men and women in spaces such as the National Assembly and the Senate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have read through the report on the two-third gender rule and what has been submitted, Mr. Speaker. And while I have a contrary opinion to some of the proposals that are in there, Mr. Speaker, I generally support that we must have more representation of both genders, equal representation of both genders in all the spaces, be it the cabinet, be it the parliament, in all the spaces where decisions are being made about lives that, that influence our actions in our society, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that in the proposal of amending Article 98 to have additional seats in the Senate to represent women, Mr. Speaker, I just want to add, and I hope that this will be considered, that while we are having all these special seats, all these affirmative seats, all these what we call nominations, Mr. Speaker, we also have to consider that you are not just being nominated because you are a woman, but because you are, first of all, a leader, and you are actively participating in the space of politics. And Mr. Speaker, that you are interested in changing the lives of Kenyans so that they can be able to see you as someone who is representing you, is representing the public in all these spaces, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, I have to say that while we are looking at additional seats or putting more affirmative actions to ensure that we reach the two-third gender rule, we also have to consider where we are sending these women. Are we sending them without a vote, Mr. Speaker? I sit in the Senate as a specially elected senator, Mr. Speaker, and you do know that my vote, when it comes to all the matters that deals with the devolution, my vote is actually carried by my delegation chair, who is the elected senator for Kisii County, Mr. Speaker. So there are times where I sit in the House, I can represent women in this House by adding my voice, by debating. But when it comes down to the power of the vote, Mr. Speaker, the fact that specially elected senators who are here to represent either the gender or working groups or whatever, they don't have a vote, Mr. Speaker. And that is something that we have to consider so that we are not just having specially elected senators who have no power to influence decisions where it matters, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that there has been a discussion on whether or not we need women in leadership, Mr. Speaker, and it's very unfortunate considering what has happened recently, considering the fact that we have lost the G7 member into a G6 member, Mr. Speaker, on the impeachment of Governor Kawira Mwangaza, Mr. Speaker. It is important that we understand that as we are making the strides in terms of gender representation, in terms of women empowerment, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of things that need to be dealt with in these spaces, Mr. Speaker. One of them being looking into policies of how we approach matters from a gender lens, Mr. Speaker. We have to understand that it is not just about nominating or pushing women into the spaces of politics, but ensuring that we are able to be mentored, we are able to be guided, and we are also able to actually positively impact this politics or governance, and also to sustain those seats, Mr. Speaker. It's very sad to have watched the several impeachment motions of Governor Kawira and actually participate in them, some of them that were in plenary, Mr. Speaker. And the matters that came up in all those impeachment motions that were tabled, you could see what was lacking was that there was no gender lens in terms of even the submissions of the impeachment, Mr. Speaker. I don't want to stand in this upper house, this very prestigious house, to say that most of the things that are happening are because of patriarchy, but Mr. Speaker, allow me to say that our culture, the Kenyan culture, the African culture, we have literally inculcated a very patriarchal tradition and in the ways that we live, in the ways that we communicate, in the ways that we are conducting business, Mr. Speaker, you can tell that we still have a long way to go, Mr. Speaker. I speak this in the background of what is happening in New York, Mr. Speaker. We have seen that at the Commission on the Status of Women, the agenda that is being pushed, Mr. Speaker, we keep talking about it, women empowerment, we keep talking about representation of women. But Mr. Speaker, in line with the International Women's Day, which is accelerate action, Mr. Speaker, we have to start actioning the things, the policies, the talks, the proposals that we are tabling. We have to start being intentional in terms of, do we really want to have women in these spaces of representation? Because if we do, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that we have to be intentional starting from this country, Mr. Speaker. I have just seen that we have had many changes in the executive, Mr. Speaker. There has been a memo that has been circulated in terms of change in office, permanent secretaries and ambassadors and all those changes that have happened, Mr. Speaker. And I was really holding my breath to see that, hoping that we, as the women of Kenya, had actually been given a minister for gender, Mr. Speaker. It has not happened yet. And that's why I want to say that we have to be intentional, because at the background of everything that is happening, we also have to hold ourselves accountable, Mr. Speaker. I am specially elected under my party, which I remain loyal to, the United Democratic Alliance. I am definitely pushing the agenda of the Kenya Kwanza Women Charter, which I was leading in drafting and presenting, a charter that our president put his signature on and promised the women of Kenya that he was going to do certain things, that he was going to ensure that the women of Kenya will feel represented, that the women of Kenya will feel as if and even feel the impact of this government in terms of certain matters that really just touch on our lives as women in this country, Mr. Speaker. I cannot belabor the point on what has been happening on the front of femicide and all the gender-based violence reports and those that have not even been reported, Mr. Speaker. We have lost so many women when it comes to gender-based violence, Mr. Speaker. We have spoken about the things that we need to do. We have given reports and recommendations, Mr. Speaker. In this house, the upper house, we have brought statements. We have actually summoned the cabinet secretaries. We had our cabinet secretary for Interior, who is now the Deputy President, Kithure Kindiki, Mr. Speaker. We have even had pronunciations being made by the President, Mr. Speaker. But I want to ask a question, Mr. Speaker. Are we really intentional as a country? Are we really intentional in terms of ending GBV, all forms of GBV, be it the violence that is meted during the intimate partner violence situations, be it the female genital mutilation, Mr. Speaker, all forms of violence, online cyberbullying, Mr. Speaker, that is meted on women. Are we actually intentional? What have we done as a government that actually signed a women's charter and promised women to stand and make sure that the women of Kenya are represented, Mr. Speaker? So even as I support this motion, this report under NADCO, even as I say that I really look forward to seeing this being, executed, Mr. Speaker, I remain hopeful, but I also am very cautious that we are not just going to end up as a talk shop, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that I always tell the president, who happens to be my party leader as well, is that, yes, we are stubborn, Mr. Speaker. I am stubborn, Mr. Speaker. I speak up, I appear to be very arrogant, and I appear to be very adamant on certain issues, Mr. Speaker. But it's because I understand the promises that we put on paper and promised the women of Kenya. And I promised myself, even as I got nominated to this seat, that if there is one thing that I will do in my time in this Senate is to ensure that whatever it is we were selling during campaign, Mr. Speaker, we talked about free sanitary towels to all schoolgirls, to all women in the vulnerable communities, Mr. Speaker. You can see in my day-to-day activities, you can see in my legislative agenda, that these are some of the things that I hold dear and that I push, Mr. Speaker. We promised the women of Kenya that we are going to have proper maternal health care, Mr. Speaker. So even in the background of the confusion that is in the SHA, of the certain challenges that are under this universal healthcare system that we are proposing, that is essentially going to revolutionize that space, Mr. Speaker, I keep asking myself, where is that specific bit? Where is maternal health care? What are we doing about Linda Mama? And that is why, Mr. Speaker, even as I get the backlash of being a part of this government, I want to say that we are working behind the scenes, because these are some of the things that I hold dearly, and I'm well aware, being a beneficiary of an affirmative action seat, Mr. Speaker, I have to make sure that at the bare minimum, my voice is heard every time we are talking about these issues, Mr. Speaker. When we talk about, aside from the femicide, the gender-based violence, representation in both the National Assembly and the Parliament or in Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, I want to also highlight that there are certain economic programs that we are having in this country that we have to intentionally put a gender lens and ensure that as we are proposing an economic program for the vulnerable, for the startup, for the youth, where are the women of Kenya in these programs? Mr. Speaker, one of the programs that has been very, very successful in the Kenya Kwanza government is the fertilizer program, Mr. Speaker. We have seen that it has yielded a lot of positive results in terms of even the harvests that we have had, the coffee production, the tea production, Mr. Speaker. But every single time I see any executive or a representative of the executive talking about the fertilizer program, I want to always ask, where are the women in that fertilizer program? How are we ensuring that in the politics of the local distribution of fertilizer, the women who are farmers, who are also hardworking Kenyans, how are they also benefiting from this program? When we talk about the program of the Hustler Fund, I'm always keen to look at the stats, the data of how women are faring, how they are borrowing, if they are paying back. Is it beneficial in their businesses, Mr. Speaker? Every single program, including now the diaspora jobs, which have been introduced, which I see the Minister of Labor going around and campaigning and telling the youth to come about. I'm always asking, how are the women of Kenya being represented in those programs? Are we just looking for drivers and manual laborers, which is exclusive to the male? Are we just saying that we want to line up all the young men because we want to take them to be manual laborers because they are strong and they have muscles? Where are the women of Kenya in that program, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, today, as a beneficiary of the affirmative action, as I stand here today, I want to say I support this latest move to ensuring that we execute the two-thirds gender, but I want to say that I am also cautiously observing if we are going to be intentional in actually seeing this execution of this report, of these amendments, of these proposals, all the way to its fruition. Because, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to matters, the women agenda, we are known to just talk and talk and talk. In fact, I have stopped accepting invitations by all these NGOs and INGOs who tell us, come, let's meet and have tea. There is a breakfast somewhere. I've told them, we have had so many breakfasts. We have been drinking tea. We have been having lunch. We like coming together as women and you know, saying, oh, this should happen, this should happen. But we must now, you know, get down to business and action the things that we have been proposing, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, I want to support this, and I want to conclude by saying that in 2025, the two-thirds gender agenda might be about having more women in office, Mr. Speaker. Many years ago, we didn't even have one governor who was a woman. So you will see that maybe in the next 10 years, the two-thirds gender rule will actually be about having more men or equal representation of men in these spaces, Mr. Speaker. So let's not the men think that this is just a women affair, because once we get to the balance where we are 50-50, Mr. Speaker, definitely at one point we are going to be talking about ensuring that both the men and the women have equal representation, and we might even just surprise ourselves, and we might have nominated members of parliament in the Senate who are actually men coming because of the affirmative action. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I submit.
Honorable Senators, I defer putting of the question to order number 20. Next order.